Hey folks, I've seen a lot of amazing reviews for Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Au, and I had really been looking forward to reading it, and I finished it just a few days ago, and it's finally snowing here in Chicago. It's finally cold enough for snow here, although in Chicago a lot of times it actually has to be warm enough to snow. But in any case, I thought it would be a good chance to come here and chat about this book. Described as a gentle, meandering novel, most reviews I've read about this book focus on the two main characters. The narrator, who is a writer, and she's in, I would guess, her 30s, and her mother. And the book takes place during a trip that this mother and daughter take to Tokyo, and it's a short vacation, and you get a sense that they haven't seen one another in quite some time. And you spend the length of this short novel following them through galleries and museums and restaurants and shops. And the narrator also takes you on quite a few tangents, quite a lot of flashbacks to her own childhood and young adulthood. So many flashbacks, in fact, that I feel like you almost spend more time flashing back than you do in Tokyo with the narrator and her mother. And when you are with the narrator and her mother in Tokyo, there's a lot of time spent on these conversations between the two of them where they seem to be trying to communicate something important to each other, but they're continuously failing to truly understand one another, truly communicate with one another. Reading this novel was a beautiful and really sensory experience. There's a lot of time and detail spent on spaces and objects, even down to the bowls that they're eating from. By the way, I'm Sarah, and I love to read books from independent publishers and then come here on YouTube to talk about them. Most reviews of this novel that I've seen, like I said, really focus on this dynamic between the mother and the daughter, on the problem of being close to someone, of loving someone, but never really being able to truly understand them. But for me, there's something else truly special at the core of Cold Enough for Snow. It's about writing. Yes, it's totally about the relationship between the mother and the daughter too. That's a really great part of this novel. But I believe that the author is using this mother-daughter trip to Tokyo to explore the process of writing a novel and doing that through the form of a novel. For me, this is a novel about writing a novel. This book was the inaugural winner of the Novel Prize, which is a biennial prize for a book-length work of literary fiction written in English. It is hosted jointly by 3 different independent publishers: Giramondo in Australia, Fitzcarraldo in the UK, and New Directions in the United States. And this edition is the New Directions edition of the novel. The prize recognizes works of fiction which explore and expand the possibilities of the form. And it celebrates novels that are innovative and imaginative in style. So that bit, expand the possibilities of the form. That's what really stuck in my mind when I first saw the description of the prize before I read the novel. I found it really interesting because those reviews of the novel that I had been seeing really focused on this mother-daughter relationship, focused on the relationship theme, which is a great subject for a novel, but it didn't seem particularly new to me. It didn't sound like something that expands the possibilities of the form. So I already kind of had an inkling that I should be looking out for something more in this novel. There had to be something formal, something about the literal form of the book that was different or new or interesting. The second thing that really tipped me off that I should be paying a little bit more attention and maybe looking for themes about writing itself within the novel is the amount of times other types of art are mentioned in the book. There is lots and lots of time spent in galleries and looking at other forms of art in this book. I had a grad school instructor who once said that anytime we find descriptions of art making in fiction, whether it be painters painting or sculptors sculpting or photographers photographing, any mention of the creation of art, we should assume that the author is not just talking about that art form, painting, sculpture, photograph, but is also talking about the art of fiction and the art of writing. That when we see art making within a narrative, it is often functioning as a proxy or a signal or a metaphor for writing as art making, and might in fact be the author talking about their own practice of making art through writing. And there are often clues within a text that help you figure out whether this is the case, whether the author is actually using these other art forms to indeed talk about writing. And guess what? Cold Enough for Snow is full of such clues. If you haven't read this novel yet but plan to, I suggest coming back later or maybe skipping ahead using the timestamps below. There is no plot in this book, so there is no chance for plot spoilers, but I am going to give sentence spoilers. And sure, it is worse for my channel if you stop here, but I don't care about me, I care about you. So just hit the like button on your way out and we'll call it even. So the first clue that this is a novel about writing is that the narrator herself is a writer. That's always a good clue. Also, as I just mentioned, throughout the novel, the narrator focuses a lot on other forms of art, painting and sculpture in particular. And you can sense every time she talks about other forms of art that she's really desperately trying to learn something from them. And it's something she's not quite able to put her finger on. In fact, she says almost exactly that several times. At first in the novel, when she encounters other forms of art, she's focusing and talking mostly about her reaction to that art as a viewer. And in particular, she focuses on the failure of language to describe what she's feeling as she's looking at that piece of art. And there's a big focus and theme throughout the novel on the failure of language to authentically and truly convey meaning and feeling, and even just to communicate at all. And a lot of reviews do point to that. But going one step further, if language so often fails us when we're trying to communicate authentically, that's a big problem if your job and your passion is writing. And I think that's a big problem that the narrator is grappling with in this novel. For example, in Tokyo, the narrator and her mother go to a museum where they see a painting, a famous painting by Monet. And the narrator says, "Sometimes I looked at a painting and felt completely nothing. Or if I had a feeling, it was only intuitive, a reaction, nothing that could be expressed in words." And she's basically telling her mother in this scene that it's okay to not have the language to express your thoughts and feelings about a piece of art. And in fact, sometimes language or over-explaining your reaction to artwork can feel false or feel like a performance. But earlier in that same, so we're talking about painting, but earlier in that same paragraph, the narrator says, "I said to my mother that I too sometimes did not understand what I saw in galleries or read in books." Aha. So she's invoking books, the word books, and the same space where we're seeing and talking about painting. So I think that's a clue. And then later on in the novel, there's a flashback where the narrator and her boyfriend see the same exact paintings by Monet in another museum at another time, same paintings. And this time, when she's telling us about seeing those paintings, she isn't describing the viewer's experience or reaction to those paintings. She focuses on the artist and on Monet himself. And she says, "It felt like the artist was looking at the field with two gazes. The first was the gaze of youth, awakening to a dawn of pink light on the grass. The second was the gaze of an older man, perhaps older than Monet had been when he had painted them, who was looking at the same view and remembering these earlier feelings and trying to recapture them, only he was unable to do so without infusing them with his own sense of inevitability." So now her focus has shifted to process, to art making, to the artist, not just the art itself. And specifically, she's talking about Monet's perspective in time in relation to the painting, which sounds suspiciously like point of view or perspective within fiction. So stick with me here. We have two gazes, younger Monet and the older Monet, which feel a heck of a lot like the gazes of the narrator. The narrator as a character within the moment with her boyfriend, with her mother, and the older narrator looking back on that moment, remembering earlier feelings and trying to recapture them and convey them, but unable to avoid her own sense of inevitability. She's talking about Monet's observational distance and what that does to his painting. He tries to infuse the painting with the freshness of encountering that scene for the very first time. He can't ever truthfully depict that because it's always going to be changed a bit by the act of remembering. And I think the narrator is relating this to her own narrative distance. How does it change a story if you're telling it after a period of time and reflecting on it? And in the very next sentence on that same page with the boyfriend and the museum and the Monet paintings of the haystacks, the narrator says, looking at them, the paintings, I felt a little like I felt sometimes after reading a certain book or hearing a fragment of a certain song. Same paintings, same Monet paintings. Both times she mentions books. And then she says, I felt that if only I could connect these things better, then I might truly have come to realize something. So again, she's trying to figure something out, trying to connect things, trying to work something out. In yet another flashback, she's visiting with her boyfriend, Laurie, different boyfriend, but she's with her boyfriend, Laurie, and they're visiting Laurie's father, who is a sculptor. The sculptor father, Laurie's dad, in this flashback, talks about his process of sculpting, how he adds and subtracts material to a sculpture, how he picks his materials based on their properties. And the narrator keeps wanting to ask him more about this process, but she can't find the right words. She feels like she can't phrase her questions correctly. She's trying to figure out something about the artist's process. And earlier on that same page, before she starts talking about process of the sculptor, she mentions dinner that she had with Laurie and his father and how they were sharing stories, family stories and memories. And she says, these stories I sensed were ones that had been told many times, passed around and shaped by the whole family, smoothed and refined with each telling. And that emphasis on smoothing and shaping and refining stories feels a whole heck of a lot like smoothing and refining and shaping sculpture. So it seems like every time she talks about art, she also invokes in that same place stories or books. And then a bit later on this same flashback trip with Laurie's dad, the narrator says, that morning I had asked Laurie's father to tell me more about his work. What I really wanted to know was how he had made the face of the sculpture, how exactly he had given it its human quality, and how, for example, had he known to balance so precisely the grave and the opaque. I felt that nothing I had ever done had been alive in this way, but it seemed that I did not even know enough to ask the right questions. I remembered too, in the garden of our home, standing next to Laurie and watching him turn the wood on a lathe, how sure and certain he was as he found a shape for it, and how I had always envied him that. So nothing she had ever done. So since she's a writer, we can assume that these things she's done is writing. All these clues, to me, point to the narrator trying to figure out how to capture something real with words. How do you inspire real emotions and responses through writing? So towards the end of the novel, there's a scene where both the mother and the daughter are compared to ghosts. And the narrator says, when my mother finally appeared, she might as well have been an apparition. She came with her puffer jacket zipped up to her chin, and in the cold night air, her breath came out in a little cloud, like a small departing spirit. The lights of a car were behind her. She walked toward me very slowly, with no clear sense of recognition on her face, as if I were the ghost she did not want to meet. In her hands, she carried a white supermarket bag. I could smell rice, hot curry. When she recognized me, her face broke out with warmth. When I read this and when I read this section, I thought of the process of creating a character and or a scene in fiction. Characters are apparitions in our brains. They exist only in words on the page and through electrical impulses in our brains. They're kind of like ghosts. But how does an author make a character feel as close to real as possible? She does it through rice and curry. Both the mother and the daughter start this paragraph as ghosts. Both are described as having these ghostly characteristics until the moment the narrator smells the rice and the curry. And then immediately in the next sentence, the mother recognizes her daughter, evoking the senses, prompting a sensory experience, an emotional response. That's what it's all about. That's what makes characters real. That's what makes novels come to life. And then at the very end of the novel, the narrator says, "My mother looked at me and smiled, as if she was simply happy that we were in each other's company and to have no need for words. We had said it seemed so little of substance to each other in these past weeks. The trip was nearly ending, and it had not done what I had wanted it to." At this point, the novel is also ending. So I think that the trip sounds a lot like the trip is ending, the novel is ending. And has the novel done what the narrator and what the author wanted it to do? And the narrator goes on, "I thought of learning Japanese, how childlike I still felt in the language, how I was capable only of asking for the simplest things, and yet I persisted because I dreamed one day of being able to say more. I thought of the instances when I had been able to converse in a string of sentences, like with the woman at the bookshop, and how good this had felt, how electric. I wanted more of those moments, to feel fluency running through me, to know someone, and to have them know me." And that's what a novelist, what a writer wants. They want to feel fluency running through them. They want to be communicating across space and time to a reader who is reading their book who knows where and who knows when. They want to convey themselves on the page so that the reader and the writer can know one another. It is not an accident that this is in first person. A novel with a first person narrator is never just about the story. It's about the story and the telling. Because the narrator, a first person narrator, has to be telling the story to someone. They are speaking to somebody. Who is this narrator speaking to? The reviews I've read say that this is a book about two people struggling to know one another. But I don't think that those two people are necessarily the mother and the daughter. I think those two people are the novelist and the reader. I think this book is about the impossible task novelists set out for themselves to convey their stories to another person, to someone they don't really know. And yet they still try. And that is what and who I think the mother and the daughter represent. But I never really trust my own reactions to books, so I did look up a few interviews with the author. In an interview with Bomb Magazine, Jessica Au says, "Another idea that comes up in the book is the trickiness of language to convey what we think. I often think that to really answer a serious question, I would have to write a novel to explain why I think the way I think, or what's formed me. You would need so much context and backstory to fully have another consciousness recognize your own, and that's how I thought the digressions could play into it. The narrator is trying to explain something about herself without saying it directly." And in Liminal Mag, she says, "I sometimes thought about Cold Enough for Snow as really trying to say only one thing, but being unable to do so with words. Rather, it would simply need to carve the space via digressions, memory, and history in which this one thing could rest." And honestly, I personally think that the one thing, the one question this novel poses is, how do you authentically answer a question with a novel? Especially if language so often fails us. And the author shows us her answer in the novel by evoking senses and using digressions and memories to bump us up against experiences. That's what this novel feels like. It feels like we're being just bumped up against different emotions and scenes and objects and smells and everything. And you're stepping in and out of conversations. It feels like it leaves you with an impression, a very sensory but hard to describe impression. So I'll return to one more quote from the book. And again, the author is back with her boyfriend's dad, the sculptor. She's talking about one piece that the sculptor's working on. It's the face of a man. And she says, "It almost seemed not to have been made by hand at all. Rather, it was more like a rock that one might glimpse in the near distance, shaped just so by the wind or by rain or by time, such that its shallow angles and shadows represented a face in some inexplicable way, and so was all the more surprising and beautiful because it was both an accident and a symbol." So many people said that this is a gentle novel, a quiet novel, but I found myself wanting to get up and shout every time I found these little gems that felt like they were a novel about writing a novel. It was so great. Do you have any other novels that you have read and love that are about the act of writing a novel? If so, let me know in the comments. I'll be back soon with more books from New Directions and Milkweed Editions. In the meantime, thanks so much for watching. Bye!